At 63 years old, Melissa Sue Anderson no longer speaks with the careful restraint of a former child star protecting an image built decades ago. Time has softened the urgency, but it has sharpened the truth. What she admits now does not arrive as scandal or accusation. It arrives quietly, almost reluctantly, like a memory that has waited its entire life to be named. For years, audiences believed they knew the world she grew up in, a world framed by wooden houses, open fields, moral certainty, and the reassuring presence of a television father America trusted. But behind the familiar warmth of that image lived a far more complicated reality, shaped by silence, pressure, and the expectations placed on a child who was expected to be flawless without ever being fragile. The image of childhood fame often appears gentle from a distance. In Melissa's case, it looked almost ideal. She did not come from a family desperate for the spotlight. Her early years were marked by balance rather than ambition. When opportunities arrived, they came naturally, drawn to a seriousness in her eyes that casting directors noticed immediately. She was not loud, not mischievous, not charming in the way Hollywood usually prefers its children to be. She was observant, inward, and emotionally precise. That quality carried her from commercials to guest roles, and eventually into the center of one of the most beloved television series of all time. From the moment she stepped into the role of Mary Ingalls, everything changed. The show was more than entertainment. It was cultural comfort. Families gathered around it, trusting it, learning from it. And at the center of that world stood Michael Landon, a man whose influence extended far beyond the frame of the camera. To viewers, he was warmth and guidance. To the industry, he was control, vision, and authority. To a young actress still learning the rules of adulthood, he was something far more difficult to define. Melissa has described him as magnetic, undeniably talented, and deeply commanding. When he entered a room, the energy shifted. Every decision passed through him. Every performance was shaped by his expectations. For adults, that intensity could be exhilarating. For children, it could be overwhelming. There were no open conversations, no gentle reassurance, no space for uncertainty. The work was the priority, and excellence was assumed rather than encouraged. Praise, when it came at all, was indirect. Approval was something you sensed rather than heard. The pressure intensified as the story demanded more from her. When Mary lost her sight, the emotional weight of the series shifted almost entirely onto Melissa's shoulders. The storyline was devastating, and audiences felt every moment of it. What they did not see was the toll it took on the child performing it. She was asked to deliver grief, fear, and resilience with absolute authenticity, without being given the language to process those emotions herself. Mistakes were not an option. Sensitivity was not a luxury. The expectation was simple and unforgiving. Perform at the highest level or fall behind. Years later, Melissa would reflect on that time with remarkable clarity. She does not deny the importance of the work. She does not dismiss the genius behind it, but she acknowledges the cost. Growing up in that environment taught her discipline and resilience, but it also taught her silence. It taught her to endure rather than to question, to observe rather than to speak, to understand power without ever feeling invited into it. As she matured, subtle tensions on set became more visible. Shifts in attention, unspoken hierarchies, moments where favor seemed to change direction without explanation. It was not cruelty in the obvious sense. It was something quieter, something that lingered. A constant awareness of where one stood and how easily that position could change. For child actor, that awareness became part of survival. Now, decades later, Melissa speaks without bitterness, but without illusion. She recognizes the legacy of the show and the brilliance of the man who created it. But she also recognizes the emotional distance that defined their working relationship. What she shares now is not designed to dismantle a legacy. It deepens it. It reminds us that even the most comforting stories are built by complicated people and lived through by children who carry those experiences far beyond the final episode. Her story begins not with accusation, but with understanding. And with that understanding comes a quiet truth that changes how the past is seen without ever erasing it. As the cameras kept rolling and the audience fell deeper in love with the gentle rhythm of frontier life, Melissa Sue Anderson was quietly growing up inside a system that rewarded composure and punished uncertainty. Fame arrived early, but it did not arrive loudly. It settled around her like an expectation she never asked for, shaping her days, her routines, and eventually her sense of self. While other children learned who they were through mistakes and freedom, Melissa learned through repetition, discipline, and the constant awareness that she was always being watched. Her childhood did not disappear overnight. It faded gradually, replaced by schedules, scripts, and the unspoken rule that emotions belonged on camera, not off it. Each morning began with preparation that went far beyond wardrobe and makeup. It meant learning to control her face, her voice, even her breathing. There was no space for hesitation once the cameras were ready. You arrived knowing your lines, your marks, and your emotions. Anything less felt like failure, even if no one said the word out loud. On the set, the atmosphere was defined by precision. Scenes were crafted carefully, performances shaped to fit a vision that left little room for improvisation. At the center of that vision stood Michael Landon, whose authority was absolute. He was not cruel, but he was firm. He believed deeply in his instincts and trusted them without question. For adults, his certainty offered direction. For children, it offered rules that were never fully explained. Melissa learned quickly that asking questions did not always lead to answers. Instead, it marked you as uncertain, and uncertainty was something the set did not tolerate easily. The safest path was observation. Watch closely, listen carefully, adjust quietly. Over time, she developed an emotional intelligence that allowed her to anticipate expectations without being told. It made her an exceptional performer, but it also meant she carried responsibility far beyond her years. As her character matured on screen, the emotional demands increased. Mary Ingalls was written as steady, moral, and restrained, qualities that mirrored Melissa's own developing personality. Yet beneath that restraint was a growing awareness of pressure that never fully lifted. Every dramatic moment carried weight, not just for the story, but for her place within the production. Success did not bring relief. It brought higher expectations. The blindness storyline marked a turning point that extended far beyond the script. It required vulnerability without offering protection. Melissa was asked to portray fear and loss with realism so convincing that audiences struggled to separate character from performer. The praise was immediate. Critics admired the subtlety. Viewers were deeply moved. Awards recognition followed. But behind the scenes, there was no pause to process what that level of emotional exposure meant for a child. In those moments, the absence of reassurance mattered. Praise, when it came, was indirect. Approval was implied rather than spoken. Landon believed the work should stand on its own, and that belief shaped how he led. From his perspective, excellence was expected, not celebrated. From Melissa's perspective, it created a quiet tension, a constant question of whether she had done enough, whether she had earned her place, whether silence meant satisfaction or disappointment. As the years passed, she became increasingly aware of the dynamics around her. Attention shifted. Relationships evolved. The set, once familiar, felt less predictable. Favor seemed to move subtly, without explanation. Younger cast members watched closely, learning where they stood by reading the room rather than being told. It was a lesson in power that few children are equipped to understand, let alone navigate. Melissa internalized those lessons. She learned to separate her identity from external validation. She learned to rely on her own judgment when praise was scarce. And she learned that survival in the industry often meant emotional distance. These skills served her well professionally, but they also shaped her personally. By the time she reached adulthood, she carried a maturity that felt both earned and imposed. Away from the set, life offered little relief. Fame followed her into public spaces, while privacy became increasingly rare. Yet she remained remarkably grounded, partly because she never allowed the industry to convince her that visibility equaled worth. Education remained important. Normalcy, wherever it could be found, was protected fiercely. She understood early that Hollywood could take far more than it gave if allowed to define a person entirely. That understanding would later inform some of the most important decisions of her life. As opportunities continued to appear, she became selective. Roles were chosen carefully, not for exposure, but for meaning. She proved repeatedly that her talent extended far beyond the image audiences associated with her childhood. Each project reaffirmed her range, her control, and her refusal to be confined by a single role. Still, the experiences of her early years lingered quietly in the background. They influenced how she viewed authority, how she responded to pressure, and how she valued emotional safety. When she eventually chose to step back from the relentless pace of Hollywood, it was not an escape. It was a deliberate act of self-preservation. She understood something many never do until it is too late. Success without balance is not success at all. Looking back now, Melissa speaks with calm honesty rather than resentment. She recognizes the complexity of the environment she grew up in and the people who shaped it. She acknowledges the brilliance of the work and the cost of creating it. Her reflections do not seek to rewrite history, but to complete it. They add dimension to a story that was once told only in soft light. Her past explains her present, not as a tragedy, but as a foundation. It reveals how a child learned strength through silence and later transformed that strength into choice. And it sets the stage for understanding the consequences that followed, both visible and unseen. Time has a way of reopening doors that once felt sealed forever. For Melissa Sue Anderson, the years did not erase the weight of her early experiences. They rearranged them, placing certain moments closer to the surface, others deeper into memory. What changed was not the past itself, but her readiness to look directly at it. The turning point did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation. It arrived quietly, through reflection, distance, and the slow accumulation of perspective that only time can provide. As adulthood settled in, Melissa's life moved steadily away from the relentless rhythm of childhood fame. She chose projects carefully, then chose silence even more deliberately. For long stretches, she stepped back from the industry entirely, prioritizing family, privacy, and a sense of normalcy she never truly had as a child. To the public, this looked like disappearance. To her, it was survival. Yet even in those quieter years, the memories remained present, shaped by moments she had never fully named. The loss of her husband later in life deepened that reflection. Grief has a way of clarifying what matters and what no longer needs protecting. In mourning, Melissa found herself revisiting earlier chapters of her life with new honesty. She began to speak more openly in interviews, not to settle scores, but to contextualize a childhood spent under extraordinary pressure. The story that emerged was not one of villainy, but of imbalance, of power held by adults and absorbed by children without the tools to challenge it. The name that inevitably returned to the center of those reflections was Michael Landon. His presence had defined the environment where her most formative years unfolded. Even decades later, his influence lingered in the way she spoke about authority, expectations, and silence. Landon had been the architect of a world that millions adored, but he was also a man who demanded unwavering excellence, often without offering emotional shelter in return. As Melissa began to articulate her experience more clearly, the emotional complexity of that relationship came into focus. Landon was not abusive in the way modern conversations often frame trauma. There were no public outbursts, no overt cruelty. Instead, there was pressure that never relaxed, standards that never softened, and an emotional distance that left young performers guessing where they stood. For a child, that uncertainty could be deeply unsettling. The blindness storyline, once again, stood as the emotional epicenter of her recollections. It was the moment where her private endurance collided with public acclaim. She had been praised for her maturity, her restraint, her ability to carry devastating emotion without excess. What few considered was the cost of achieving that restraint. To perform grief convincingly at such a young age required drawing from places she did not yet understand. She delivered what was asked of her because failure felt unimaginable. In hindsight, Melissa recognized that those expectations blurred important boundaries. She was treated as a professional before she had finished being a child. The production valued her discipline, her reliability, her emotional control. It did not always acknowledge her vulnerability. That imbalance shaped her internal world in ways that only became clear much later. She learned to associate worth with performance, approval with silence, and strength with emotional containment. As the industry around her evolved, Melissa's voice matured with it. She watched conversations emerge about child actors, about consent, about psychological safety on set. These discussions offered language for feelings she had never fully articulated. They allowed her to frame her experiences not as isolated discomforts, but as part of a broader pattern that many child performers shared. Recognition did not come with anger. It came with understanding. When she finally spoke openly about Landon's leadership style, her tone surprised many. There was no bitterness, no desire to dismantle his legacy. Instead, there was honesty layered with restraint. She acknowledged his genius, his dedication, and the immense impact of his work. She also acknowledged the emotional cost of growing up under such intensity. Both truths existed simultaneously, and she refused to sacrifice one for the other. Public reaction to her admissions was swift and divided. Some viewers struggled to reconcile her experience with their cherished image of the show. Others recognized the familiar pattern of childhood labor hidden behind wholesome narratives. For Melissa, the reaction was secondary. What mattered was finally aligning her public story with her internal truth. Silence had protected her career once. It no longer served her. Speaking out did not reopen wounds so much as it allowed them to heal properly. By naming the pressure, the distance, and the emotional expectations placed on her, Melissa reclaimed ownership of her story. She reframed her childhood not as a cautionary tale, but as a complex journey marked by both achievement and cost. The act of telling the truth became an extension of the control she had long sought. This moment in her life did not feel like an ending. It felt like a recalibration. The past no longer loomed as something unresolved. It became a chapter she could reference without being defined by it. Her reflections offered a rare glimpse into the emotional realities behind a cultural icon, reminding audiences that even the most comforting stories are created by imperfect people and lived through by children navigating adult expectations. Melissa Sue Anderson's honesty stands not as an indictment, but as an invitation to look more closely at the systems that shape young talent, to question narratives that prioritize results over well-being, and to understand that truth, when told with clarity and compassion, does not diminish legacy. It deepens it. The consequences of those years did not arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, woven into choices that seemed practical on the surface, but carried deeper emotional logic underneath. For Melissa Sue Anderson, the aftermath of growing up under relentless expectations revealed itself not through breakdowns or public crises, but through quiet recalibration. She began to measure success differently. Fame no longer felt like proof of worth. Visibility no longer felt essential. What mattered instead was control over her own time, her own boundaries, and her own sense of safety. As the industry continued to evolve, Melissa noticed how easily childhood experiences follow performers into adulthood. Many former child actors struggled publicly, their pain turning into spectacle. She watched those stories with a mix of empathy and resolve. Her response was not rebellion, but withdrawal. She stepped back deliberately, reducing her exposure and choosing projects that aligned with her emotional readiness rather than her public profile. This was not a retreat born of fear. It was a strategic decision shaped by years of living inside a system where expectations were always higher than reassurance. The psychological impact of her early career surfaced most clearly in how she approached authority. She had learned early that power often operated silently, that approval was rarely spoken aloud, and that questioning direction could carry unspoken consequences. As an adult, she became deeply protective of her autonomy. She trusted her instincts and resisted environments that echoed the imbalance of her past. The industry noticed her absence, but she did not feel the need to explain it. For the first time, distance felt like freedom rather than loss. Relationships, too, were shaped by those formative years. Melissa valued stability, consistency, and emotional clarity. She gravitated toward people who communicated directly, who did not rely on unspoken hierarchies or shifting approval. Her marriage reflected that priority. It was grounded, private, and intentionally removed from the spectacle of Hollywood. Family became not just a refuge, but a redefinition of success. In choosing that path, she rejected the notion that personal fulfillment must come at the cost of visibility. The legacy of her experiences on set extended into her parenting. Having lived through the pressures of early fame, she made a conscious effort to shield her children from similar exposure. Privacy was not a luxury to her. It was a necessity. She understood the long-term consequences of growing up under constant observation, of having identity shaped by public expectation. Protecting her family from that environment felt like correcting a balance she never had the chance to establish as a child. Public response to her later reflections revealed how deeply audiences cling to idealized narratives. For many, Little House on the Prairie represented innocence and moral certainty. Any suggestion of complexity behind the scenes felt unsettling. Melissa's honesty challenged that comfort, not by dismantling the show's values, but by exposing the human cost of creating them. The discomfort some viewers felt mirrored a broader cultural shift, one that increasingly recognizes that wholesome outcomes do not guarantee healthy processes. The industry's response was quieter, but no less telling. Conversations about child labor laws, psychological safety, and emotional support on set had gained traction over the years. Melissa's story added weight to those discussions. It did not serve as a cautionary tale filled with extremes. Instead, it illustrated how subtle pressures can leave lasting marks, how silence, when normalized, can shape identity just as powerfully as overt harm. Her reflections also reframed the legacy of Michael Landon in a more nuanced light. She never denied his talent or his contribution to television history. She acknowledged the warmth he brought to the screen and the discipline he demanded behind it. What changed was the framing. The image of the benevolent patriarch expanded to include the reality of a leader whose intensity, while effective creatively, left little room for emotional accommodation. Both truths existed simultaneously, and recognizing one did not erase the other. For Melissa, the act of speaking openly was not about assigning blame. It was about integration. By aligning her public narrative with her internal experience, she closed a chapter that had remained partially open for decades. The result was not anger or regret, but clarity. Her past no longer defined her choices unconsciously. It informed them deliberately. The broader consequence of her story lies in its resonance. It echoes the experiences of countless performers whose childhoods unfolded under professional demands. It invites audiences to reconsider the cost of perfection and the unseen labor behind beloved entertainment. And it challenges the industry to reflect on how easily success can overshadow care. Melissa Sue Anderson's journey through fame, silence, and eventual reflection reveals that consequences are not always dramatic. Sometimes they appear as careful decisions, as boundaries drawn quietly, as lives shaped with intention rather than reaction. Her story reminds us that survival does not always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like redefining what success means and choosing peace over applause. Even in the quieter chapters of her life, Melissa Sue Anderson carried a wealth of stories few would ever know. These were not tales meant for publicity or headline. They were moments of private endurance, quiet victories, and subtle revelation. Each role she chose after stepping back from constant visibility was a deliberate act of agency, a claim over the narrative she had long been denied as a child. The performances were smaller in scale, yes, but they bore an intimacy and authenticity that could never be manufactured. She found solace in projects that spoke to her personally, whether lending her voice to animated stories from the Bible, appearing briefly in a mystery revival, or taking on a low-profile thriller. Melissa approached every part with the same dedication that had defined her career as a young actress. But now, her presence on set carried something different. She was no longer navigating the pressures imposed by others. She was guiding herself. Her choices reflected priorities shaped by decades of experience and reflection, and that deliberate control became a defining feature of her later career. Behind the camera, in spaces away from the public eye, Melissa's life was rooted in the ordinary. She devoted herself to family life, creating a home in which stability and love outweighed fame or recognition. Her children, Piper and Griffin, grew up with routines and privacy she had longed for during her own youth. Her decisions were not sacrifices, but conscious acts of preservation, ensuring that her family could flourish without the silent pressures she had endured. In this environment, she discovered dimensions of herself that had been suppressed for years: patience, creativity without constraint, and joy in simplicity. Yet, the shadow of the past never fully lifted. Even within peaceful routines, memories of the intense demands of early stardom lingered. Melissa reflected often on the subtle dynamics of the set, the unspoken hierarchies, the way attention shifted depending on performance or perceived alignment with authority. These observations were not bitterness. They were recognition of how systems operate, a wisdom acquired through direct experience. She recognized the forces that shaped her, and she chose to navigate the rest of her life with that understanding as guidance. Her memoir, The Way I See It, offered an unprecedented glimpse into this private world. Through its pages, she revealed not only anecdotes of on-set interactions, but also the internal landscapes she navigated while balancing expectation with authenticity. Readers encountered a woman who had lived under extraordinary scrutiny and emerged with perspective, insight, and a nuanced understanding of human complexity. Melissa did not vilify those who had guided or constrained her. Instead, she illuminated the layers of experience that had made her both resilient and introspective. Even in projects that seemed minor by public standards, her commitment never wavered. A brief appearance in a television movie, a voiceover in an animated project, or a cameo in a short film became opportunities to apply the full depth of her craft. Her performances carried weight not through spectacle, but through emotional truth. She drew on the memory of her youth, its challenges, its pressures, and its lessons to inform these choices, creating work that resonated quietly but powerfully with those who paid attention. Friends and collaborators observed this quietly commanding presence. They noted that Melissa had evolved into a professional whose authority came from experience rather than position. She could guide a scene, shape a character, and convey complexity with subtle gestures rather than overt direction. Her insight into the human condition, honed from childhood exposure to adult expectations, became a tool she wielded thoughtfully, both on screen and off. There were also moments of reconnection with her earlier life. Attending interviews, public events, and fan gatherings, Melissa projected calm confidence. She spoke about Little House on the Prairie with warmth, acknowledging the joy it had brought millions while offering measured reflections on the pressures it entailed. She never shied from addressing the nuances of growing up on such a set, but she did so with dignity, ensuring that the narrative remained hers to tell. The story was hers to frame, and in doing so, she reclaimed authority over a childhood once defined by others' expectations. Through these experiences, Melissa demonstrated a quiet kind of courage. It was the courage to live intentionally, to choose projects and interactions that aligned with her values, and to accept the realities of her past without being constrained by them. Each decision reinforced a pattern. She would not allow external pressures to dictate the terms of her life or the interpretation of her story. This mindset allowed her to engage creatively without fear and to nurture her family without compromise. At the same time, Melissa maintained an awareness of the broader implications of her journey. She recognized that her experiences were emblematic of the challenges faced by many young performers. She understood that what appeared seamless on screen often required sacrifice, vigilance, and emotional labor. By sharing glimpses of her private world, she offered insight into the hidden dimensions of fame and its consequences. She reminded audiences that the work they admired had been accomplished by a child navigating an adult world, often without support or clarity. This commitment to truth extended beyond narrative to emotion. Melissa cultivated spaces where authenticity was prioritized over performance. In interviews, she allowed herself to acknowledge the moments of doubt, tension, and challenge she had endured. In her professional choices, she sought roles that demanded depth without exploitation. In her family life, she created stability and openness as a counterbalance to early pressures. Every aspect of her life became a deliberate act of reflection and balance, demonstrating a profound understanding of how experience shapes action. Melissa Sue Anderson's later career and personal life illustrate the ways in which a child star can evolve into a fully realized adult without losing connection to the craft that defined them. She has shown that resilience does not require detachment from emotion, but the integration of experience in a choice. Her story, both on and off screen, offers a blueprint for navigating the lingering effects of early fame, a balance of honesty, discipline, and intentionality that allows for both personal fulfillment and meaningful creative expression. Even as time moved forward, Melissa Sue Anderson carried with her the echoes of childhood lived in the spotlight. The lessons she learned early on, discipline, emotional restraint, and attentiveness to authority, shaped not only her career but the person she became. She understood the paradox of her journey. Fame had brought opportunity, acclaim, and recognition, yet it had demanded sacrifices few could see. The years that followed were as much about reclaiming control as they were about continuing to practice her craft. Her decisions were deliberate, guided by a sense of what mattered most. Melissa prioritized family over fame, privacy over publicity, and depth over breadth in her work. Her marriage to Michael Sloan exemplified this approach. Together, they built a life that balanced creativity with domestic stability, a home where her children could grow without the constant gaze of cameras. Each choice reinforced the value she placed on agency and intentionality, allowing her to navigate adulthood on her own terms rather than being defined by the expectations of her youth. Professionally, Melissa's later roles reflected a matured artistry. She gravitated toward projects that allowed her to explore complex characters in smaller, more intimate settings. Whether it was a guest appearance, a voiceover, or a dramatic television movie, she approached each role with the same commitment she had as a child, but with the freedom to set her own boundaries. Her performances became exercises in subtlety and authenticity, demonstrating that true skill is not measured by visibility, but by emotional truth. The legacy of her experiences on Little House on the Prairie informed this approach. She understood the lasting impact of early exposure to adult pressures and applied that understanding to her own life. Melissa also reflected on the broader significance of her story. Her experiences exemplify how childhood environments shape adult resilience, emotional intelligence, and the capacity for measured decision-making. She recognized that the brilliance of Michael Landon's vision came with intensity that was both inspiring and exacting, as she learned to navigate that intensity without losing her sense of self. Sharing these reflections has provided valuable perspective for fans and for the industry, illustrating the complex interplay between guidance, expectation, and personal growth. Family remained the central axis of her life. Raising her children with care and intentionality allowed her to cultivate the sense of normalcy she had longed for as a child. By consciously creating boundaries around exposure and choice, she ensured that her family life was defined by values she could control rather than by external pressures. This approach reinforced her belief that success is multidimensional, measured not just in achievement or recognition, but in the quality of relationships and the integrity of one's life choices. At the same time, Melissa never abandoned her craft. She returned to acting selectively, bringing to each role the insight gained from a lifetime of experience. Her later work, though often low profile, was marked by refinement, depth, and quiet authority. The skills honed under high expectations in childhood, discipline, observation, emotional control, were now applied with intention and context, creating performances that were rich in subtlety and resonance. Melissa's reflections on Michael Landon illustrate her nuanced understanding of legacy. She acknowledges his genius and his central role in shaping a beloved cultural narrative, while also recognizing the pressures that came with working under his direction. By presenting both truths together, she offers a complete picture: brilliance intertwined with exacting standards, warmth intertwined with distance. Her perspective invites audiences to appreciate the artistry while understanding the personal cost that accompanied it. Her story demonstrates the enduring power of agency. By choosing which projects to undertake, when to step back, and how to frame her narrative publicly, Melissa reclaimed the autonomy that had been limited during her formative years. She turned the lessons of discipline, restraint, and observation into tools for crafting a life aligned with her values, demonstrating that reflection and intentionality can transform early hardship into lifelong strength. In contemplating her journey, Melissa also considers the broader implications for the industry. Child actors, she recognizes, carry unique vulnerabilities that require guidance, support, and clear boundaries. Her story underscores the importance of cultivating environments where creativity can flourish without compromising emotional safety. In doing so, she not only illuminates her own path, but also provides a template for nurturing talent responsibly. Ultimately, Melissa Sue Anderson's later years embody the reconciliation of past and present. She has integrated the lessons of childhood fame, the pressures of professional expectation, and the value of personal choice into a coherent life philosophy. Her legacy extends beyond performance. It encompasses resilience, reflection, intentionality, and the prioritization of authenticity over spectacle. Through her journey, she illustrates that true artistry is inseparable from self-awareness and that a life well-lived honors both talent and the humanity that nurtures it. As the final scenes of her career quietly drew to a close, Melissa Sue Anderson could look back on a life that had been lived with both intention and resilience. Her journey, from a bright-eyed child stepping onto the set of Little House on the Prairie to a seasoned adult making deliberate choices about family and craft, is a story of balance between external expectation and internal integrity. The public knew her as Mary Ingalls, the composed, moral, and emotionally compelling eldest daughter, but few truly understood the layers of discipline, reflection, and emotional labor that underpinned that performance. Melissa's legacy is multifaceted. On one hand, it is the tangible record of performances that touched audiences across generations. Her portrayal of Mary Ingalls remains a benchmark for child acting, embodying authenticity, subtlety, and depth. Awards and critical recognition punctuate her career, but they tell only part of the story. The other part resides in the careful decisions she made after stepping back from relentless visibility, prioritizing family, stability, and meaningful engagement over constant exposure. Her later years reveal a woman who deliberately constructed a life of quiet significance. Each project she chose, no matter how small in scale, reflected a combination of passion, expertise, and careful consideration. She returned to acting selectively, bringing the insight gained from decades of experience to every role. Even brief appearances or voice work carried emotional weight and creative integrity, demonstrating that her artistry had not diminished but had matured, tempered by experience and grounded by choice. Beyond professional accomplishments, Melissa's personal life stands as a testament to the values she held dear. She cultivated a family environment that offered her children a sense of normalcy she had longed for in her own youth. Privacy, stability, and love became central pillars. Her marriage, grounded in mutual respect and shared passion for storytelling, endured decades, offering continuity and comfort that contrasted sharply with the early pressures of Hollywood. Through this, Melissa demonstrated that legacy is not measured solely by public acclaim, but by the quality of relationships, the nurturing of others, and the integrity of one's life path. Her reflections on her relationship with Michael Landon offer another dimension to her story. She acknowledges his brilliance, leadership, and vision, which shaped one of television's most enduring series. At the same time, she recounts the pressures, emotional distance, and high expectations that accompanied working under his guidance as a child. By presenting these truths side by side, she provides a nuanced understanding. One can respect and honor artistic genius while recognizing the complexity of its human costs. This perspective adds richness to her legacy, reminding audiences that creative achievement often carries hidden demands. Melissa's willingness to share her experiences, both publicly and through her memoir, contributes to a broader conversation about the challenges faced by child actors and the importance of emotional support in high-pressure environments. She offers insight into the delicate balance between discipline and care, expectation and empathy, fame and personal development. Her story encourages reflection on how talent is nurtured, how childhood is preserved, and how growth can emerge from even the most demanding circumstances. In considering her life as a whole, one sees a pattern of deliberate, thoughtful choices. She did not seek constant recognition. She did not allow early exposure to dictate the terms of her adulthood. Instead, she reclaimed authority over her own narrative, making decisions that aligned with her values and the life she wished to lead. Each pause, each careful engagement with her craft, and each act of prioritizing family over fame reflects a coherent philosophy. Success is defined not by visibility, but by authenticity, by integrity, and by the ability to act in accordance with one's own standards. Melissa Sue Anderson's story resonates because it is both specific and universal. It is specific in the details of her career, her family life, and the pressures of growing up under the direction of Michael Landon. It is universal in its exploration of human resilience, the negotiation between external expectation and internal integrity, and the pursuit of meaning beyond superficial measures of success. Her journey illustrates that fulfillment requires both discipline and reflection, courage and patience, ambition and self-compassion. As her career gradually concluded with understated grace, each choice she made reinforced the central themes of her life: authenticity, emotional intelligence, and the conscious creation of a life that reflects one's values. Even brief final appearances, from cameos to voice work, carried the weight of experience and the clarity of purpose that defined her later years. She did not need to reclaim the spotlight. She had already claimed her narrative and, in doing so, had crafted a life that was both remarkable and deeply personal. Ultimately, Melissa Sue Anderson's life story is one of quiet triumph over circumstance. It is the tale of a child actor who navigated extraordinary pressures, learned to harness her experiences, and emerged as an adult who defines her own path. It is a story that honors her work, her wisdom, and her commitment to herself and her family. Her legacy endures not only in the character she portrayed, but in the deliberate and thoughtful life she built, demonstrating that true accomplishment encompasses both public achievement and a private cultivation of values, relationships, and self-understanding.